In 1966, an Inuit hunter spent his final days in the vast system of sanatoriums built to treat tuberculosis among Native peoples in Canada. He was writing his autobiography, I Nuliak, about growing up at a remote whaling station in the Arctic Ocean, Herschel Island. Born in the Stone Age to die in suburbia, thousands of kilometers from home, the words he wrote took him back to that distant island, where he first saw strange ships approaching on the horizon.
I, Nuliak, will tell you a story. It is the story of what has happened to me in my life. All my adventures, many of them forever graven in my memory. But my mind was always alert to the happenings around me. Once my eyes had seen something, it was never forgotten.
When the missionaries first arrived, they described this as, Sodom and Gomorrah. Alcohol and wild parties and women being dragged onto ships. They said it is worse than any American frontier town, worse than Dawson City or Skagway. They said Herschel Island was the most debauched place you could possibly find.
The Inuvialuit, in the space of 2 or 3 generations, underwent a degree of change as great or greater than that of any other human group in all of history that survived in the end. They came as close to being destroyed as you could imagine, and it's surprising, really, that they weren't.
Nuliak was caught between 2 worlds, the ancient hunting culture of his Inuvialuit people and the hunger for natural resources of the manufacturing empire to the south that had reached even this place at the end of the earth. In the 1850s, the American whaling fleet sailed through the Bering Strait into the Arctic Ocean north of Alaska. Slaughtering the whales of that region to near extinction, they ventured east into Canadian waters, entering what was known as the Forbidden Sea.
In about 1888, a man named Joe Tuckfield was sent east just to find out what was there.
Tuckfield goes to the Mackenzie Delta. He talks to local people, and he finds one of the few decent harbors on that stretch of coast, Pauline Cove on Herschel, and he found lots of whales.
Tuckfield comes back with a bonanza discovery, a find on the scale of a Klondike gold rush for whalers. His description was beautiful because he said that the waters around Herschel Island, the whales were as thick as bees. We have struck the El Dorado of whaling, and it's at a place called Herschel Island.
There's just pandemonium. This is like the gold rush. The whaling community here is overjoyed to hear this. Within a week, there are 5 whaling ships anchored at Pauline Cove, and they're off and running.
In the century before they reached Herschel, American whaling ships circled the earth in search of these huge mammals. Whale oil was in demand to grease the wheels of the Industrial Revolution. By the 1880s, the supply had begun to run out. The Arctic would be the last frontier for the epic hunts, a sea of slaughter unprecedented in its scale and speed. As petroleum products began to replace whale oil, ships sought only the cartilage-like baleen for the manufacture of corsets. The prize baleen is found in the mouth of the giant bowhead whale, native to these waters. Not only was the whaling good, the vessels found the shelter of a natural port, hard to find on this rugged, dangerous coast. But with the arrival of so many newcomers, native food supplies plummeted. An Arctic oasis soon became a wasteland. Nuliak and his grandmother, Anana, living on the edge of starvation, had to leave the island in search of food.
I was a child living at Herschel. We did not have any more to eat. But thanks to the squirrels I caught, she did not suffer from hunger. But I had just one snare. I was 10 years old.
Anana and Nuliak followed a group of Inuvialuit, crossing the ice to the mainland to hunt. A communal society, the hunters would provide for them as long as there was enough food, living off caribou, seals, and birds.
My shabby clothes hardly protected me during the trip, and I was cold. I wept more than once.
While the Inuvialuit could travel anywhere in this Arctic expanse, the whalers had to seek shelter before the worst of winter descended.
Pauline Cove is a relatively small little cove, but it was very nicely sheltered. One of the difficulties in Arctic whaling is that you had to get in and out the same season. Because if you didn't and you left the ship in the ice, the ship would actually be crushed. And so what Herschel Island had to offer was a place to stay. You could winter over, get another whole year of hunting, and then go out before the ice came that following year.
They normally have to overwinter twice to fill up their cargo holds, and then they go back to San Francisco the next year. The best year was in 1894-95, when there were 15 whaling ships overwintered that winter at Herschel. There were about 1,000 men living on Herschel Island under the nominal control of 15 whaling captains.
They knew that the whaling industry was a boom and bust industry, that when you got into an area, you over-harvested it pretty fast and you moved along. So Herschel Island itself was a bit of a slap-together kind of community.
The first street of driftwood shacks on Herschel Shore was christened Society Row. The whalers organized diversions, from fancy dress balls to baseball games, depicted here by one of the sailors. But one day, caught in a blizzard, 3 ball players froze to death.
People who didn't have the faintest clue about each other all of a sudden are living on the same very small piece of land.
My father died before I was able to know him. Because I was the Iliapak, the poor little orphan boy, I really knew what misery meant, and my clothes were little better than rags. My mother married once again, and so my grandmother took care of me. She could not walk, for one of her legs was covered with sores. In those days, I lived alone with her. We were very poor.
The impact of the whalers on a fragile local ecology was devastating. Anana and Nuliak hitched a ride with Inuit hunters bound for Kittigaruit, the town where Nuliak was born. Kittigaruit was the center for one of the most prosperous Inuit groups in Canada, the heart of Inuvialuit culture. But when they arrived, they discovered a community on its last legs. Measles, brought by a visiting whaling ship, had decimated the community.
Diseases that were childhood diseases in Europe were killers among the Inuit population. Chickenpox among the Inuvialuit population could kill 10% of the population in a month. Add to that influenza, meningitis, whooping cough, measles.
Nobody knew about flu or measles or nothing. The flu was so strong while they were still smoking, dropped dead. They had tobacco then. While they were playing cards, they dropped dead. That's how strong the flu was. In Herschel Island, maybe 200-300 died in one spring. It was white man disease. They never They never died like that before.
I once talked to an old woman in a Klavik who, as a child, had woken up in a house in the middle of winter, and everyone else was dead. She was 4 or 5 years old. The nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and everyone was dead.
Nuliak would return to Kittigarawit as an old man. By then, just an abandoned stretch of Arctic coastline, this place of the ancestors was still revered by the Inuvialuit.
That summer, the Kittigarawit people fell ill and many of them died. Almost the whole village perished. During that time, 2 of the Eskimos spent all their time burying the dead. Corpses were set on the ground uncoffined. Before we youngsters could learn from the old, a severe illness carried them away.
So many of our people were wiped out because of diseases. Like to go from 4,000 just in one settlement to down to about 250 people. You lose a lot of old people and a lot of their knowledge.
It's beyond living memory now, of course. And it's almost beyond the kind of memory that you pass down in detail. It really marks the end of traditional Inuvialuit life. If 95% of your population dies, how do you come out the other side as an intact culture?
Winter came, and one day we saw a huge pack of wolves out at sea on the ice, heading east. There were so many of them that the last ones were still in front of us when the leaders had disappeared on the eastern horizon. It was said that they had feasted on the bodies left on the Kittigarawit land and were now continuing their travels.
As epidemic after epidemic spread among his people, Nuliak would one day watch Anana, finally unable to walk, die alone on the ice.
Anana fell sick. The tent where we lived was cold, freezingly cold. She got worse and became seriously ill. Soon our companions decided to leave. Nina called me. "Little one, don't stay here alone. Go, follow the rest." Those were her last words. All that day was for me a day of profound unhappiness. I wept. I had lost my grandmother.
Nuliak followed his grandmother's advice and returned to Herschel Island. As he grew into his teens, he began to find jobs on the whaling ships.
When the sea was covered with water, we finally reached the island that the Eskimo call Krikatariak, Herschel, the great big town. Whaling was done on a grand scale, and there were a great number of whaling vessels. The whites had raised big buildings, stores and houses, and the population of Herschel was large and mixed. Crowds of Eskimos came there. There were Alaskan Eskimos and a large group of Inuit from the Siberian coast who were working on the ships.
When you look at Herschel Island as an Inuvialuit would have looked at it, the experience was often one of wonder. The scale of the buildings, the scale of the ships, the noise, the activity levels, the material wealth, the dozens and dozens and dozens of new things that for a young Inuit boy would have been brand new, things they had not seen before.
First time they're seeing somebody smoking, they're trying to find out what kind of power is that. They puff of smoke come out their mouth. They're eating fires that
The sailors knew 100 different ways of amusing themselves. They always had something in their mouths, something they chewed. It so intrigued me that I kept staring at their jaws. One certain day, that thing was given to me. I chewed. It was delicious. It was chewing gum. From that day, I was able to recognize some of these white man's things.
Because he was alone and adrift, Nuliak increasingly began to live in two worlds.
A boat came in from the east. Charlie Walker motioned me aboard the whaler while the whites made a place for me. There were many Eskimos working on the ship. I was surprised to hear the Inuit speak the white man's language and speak it well. My presence seemed to bring the ship good luck. On the sea, we hunted the white whale. It was I who took the helm. From then on, there was not a dull day for me, as everyone desired my company. I became known as Nukat Birala, the little man.
The remains of the whaling station at Pauline Cove bear silent testimony to a time when this was one of the largest communities on the Arctic coast. The island is now protected as a Yukon park. Richard Gordon, a descendant of the Inuvialuit hunters who once lived here, is a warden.
All animals were very important to the cultural lifestyle of the Inuvialuit. A lot of times you would hear that comment to say, only take what you're going to eat and don't take any more than that, because those animals, if you take more than that, will deplete, and it takes time for the numbers to come up. So managing your resources, looking after the land and all that is very important to our people.
As demand for baleen in the south increased, the price for the head of a bowhead rose as high as $10,000, a small fortune at the time, while the population in the northern oceans hit an all-time low. This final El Dorado of whaling was drawing to a close. Its fatal impact was nowhere felt more strongly than among the Inuvialuit.
They're over-hunting at a very ferocious pace. Their appetites were voracious. They quickly stripped an area of easily harvested animals very, very fast.
They were exterminating the whales. They'd already killed the western population off North Alaska, and now they're moving east into the last refuge of the bowhead.
Once the whale had been killed, the head would be cut off and the body dumped back into the sea.
You didn't have to take the time to carve the bowhead into the oil and whatnot. It was just a matter of catching the bowhead, slicing it off at the neck, and then bang, and you can put 20 heads on one ship.
The best catch ever was 67, the baleen of 67 whales, which would be worth at least $500,000.
A grim reminder to the Inuvialuit of how differently the white man viewed the natural world, were the hundreds of headless whales floating on the Northern Ocean.
The stories that you hear from the others, they seen it, they know it was a waste and whatever, but they had no say as to how these things were managed.
The Inuvialuit sensed that much more than the whale was in danger. A land once so full of game became empty and silent as the repeating rifle took its toll. Young men like Nuliak now hunted to satisfy the appetite of the whalers. Hired to destroy their own world, the Inuvialuit began to lose heart.
The whaling ships hired large numbers. Most of the crews were native. If not working as crews on the ships, they were professional meat hunters. They'd go shoot caribou, because that's what the whalers liked to eat, was caribou, and bring them to the whaling ships and sell them. And there were, tens of thousands of caribou killed to feed the whalers.
Today, small herds of caribou still swim the channel that separates Herschel from the mainland. A family has arrived on the island, the Cockneys, descendants of Nuliak. Richard Gordon has agreed to take the younger members on a caribou hunt, as long as they respect the old ways. These are the kids most at risk in today's North, where drug abuse has become yet another epidemic.
So we'll that mound over here, I think.
We'll go underneath here, and then we'll have a look again from there. They might move this way, you know?
They're going down in that little valley thing.
If they go to that gully, we'll work out, we'll stay out of sight from them. Okay?
Big bulls.
Big bulls, yeah.
I started to run after the tuk-tuk, the caribou, following the low valley between two ridges. They were going fast. But before they were too far off, I caught up with them without knowing how I did it. I must have run like the wind.
Come on up, join the crowd.
Yeah, come and join the crowd, that one.
Traditionally, the caribou hunts on Herschel were for much more than food. Sinew was used as thread, bones to make needles, and the hides became the clothes that meant the difference between life and death in the Arctic winter.
Wool and leather just can't keep you warm. You need caribou skin clothing, and only Native women could produce caribou skin clothing. So they would hire Native seamstresses who would come right onto the ships and sew and keep people properly clothed. And this would often lead to other kinds of relationships too, of course, but seamstresses would be often how they would appear in the books. Some of them were pretty rough guys, poorly educated, pretty hard cases, I think would be the term.
You put them in a place where there is really no law, there are no social restraints or police to keep them in check.
The idea of sexual jealousy was never an important part of Inuvialuit culture. And sometimes husbands went along with this because they got bought off.
You have a white man for a friend, you share your wife with him. When they take their woman to the ship, they would give her a bottle, give it to your husband.
Certainly it had terrible destabilizing effects. Marriages would be broken up, they might get back together again when the white guy goes away.
There were whalers who came up who treated Native women with respect, and they fit into the Inuit sort of way of life. You have other situations where women were, for all intents and purposes, kidnapped onto whaling boats.
There was one captain, Nuth, I think was his name, Captain Nuth, who was called the kindergarten captain because he was extremely interested in prepubescent girls whose parents he would bribe and so on and so forth. Pretty unseemly stuff.
The scars of the whaling era run deep. Inuvialuit whose families were affected keep returning to Herschel.
Most of the stories we hear are not very good. The impact that they made on our culture. It's a side that I really didn't explore because it just makes me angry, and sad of the way they treated the Inuit people. I stopped reading about them because it just affected me so much.
By the early years of the 20th century, the number of whaling ships in the Arctic diminished. The land and sea began to return to their timeless selves.
That summer, the whalers' catch was scanty. Too much ice. western wind had blown steadily all summer. The ships that had to return home weighed anchor about mid-August, but they could not break through the ice surrounding Herschel and were forced to return. They were icebound.
I think up to 3 years, some of them would stay. You know, if you're in this area in the dead of winter, isolated, cut off from the world for months at a time, don't even know what's going on out there. Some of these younger people couldn't handle it.
They would desert, and what they were trying to do really was get down to the gold fields in the Dawson area where they thought they could make a mint. But they didn't really know where they were. They didn't really know how to get there.
Word had arrived that 800 kilometers to the south, gold had been discovered in Dawson City. To stir-crazy whalers, the temptation was often too great. But hunted down by their captains on the open tundra, few deserters made it across the Richardson Mountains to Shangri-La. To remove the temptation, more alcohol was brought to Herschel. Now the whalers could indulge their vices at will. But for the Inuvialuit, drink was becoming an escape from the humiliation they had suffered, a descent into oblivion for a culture that had lost its self-respect.
No one understood it, and there was no treatment. Going back to the others, that's one of the ugly stories that they don't like to talk about or remember, because alcohol brings so hardship to everyone. Seeing the native people of the area totally lost.
There were drinking bouts almost every day. People would drink anything. One day, while we were playing, our attention was drawn to an Eskimo who had drunk too much. It had taken 3 people to subdue him and tie him securely with ropes. Bound hand and foot, he was thrown into a house and the single door locked after him. The whites went home, and I saw their prisoner escape. No ropes could even hold him, for he was an Angatko, a witch doctor or shaman.
The hunter who had escaped was Kablualuk, a famous shaman among his people. Legend says he had turned himself into the feather of a falcon, his spirit animal, and floated up the chimney to freedom. The 4 walls of the white world would never contain the mystical powers of the Inuvialuit. But the powers of a shaman were seen as devil worship by a new wave of outsiders, missionaries intent on saving the souls of the Inuvialuit.
Stringer was the first. Stringer came in the early 90s. He didn't make a single conversion in the first, say, 6 years that he was there. And in his diary, there's, despair comes through the pages, beseeching God, and how have I failed these people?
When the missionaries first arrived, they described this as Sodom and Gomorrah. They described Herschel Island as being the most debauched place in Western North America.
The missionaries were consciously motivated by the highest ideals here, but in their own way, they're as destructive of native culture as the whalers ever were. They were up there to change people. They were up there to destroy the whole intellectual basis of Inuvialuit culture, the whole way it operated, all of the religious beliefs, the spiritual beliefs, which animated everything they did.
Isaac Stringer brought a second Anglican missionary to Herschel, Charles Whitaker. Whitaker would convert the Inuvialuit Stringer had failed to reach, but there would be a price.
Whitaker is the one who baptized the Inuvialuit. Basically en masse, beginning in 1907 for the next 5 or 6 years. The whole community, converted, however, nominally. It's a little bit like splashing everyone with holy water, whether they know it or not.
A minister, Mr. Whitaker, arrived. He poured water on a great number of people. A number of them did not even know what this ceremony was all about. The minister said to an Eskimo, "I give you the name of Hayden." The Eskimo answered, "What a queer name you are giving me." He did not want to be called that way. We are losing our customs, our manner of living. The young Inuit are learning the white man's way of life, while our own is fading away.
Nuliak himself was given the name Robert Cockney. The community was beginning to fall apart. An Inuvialuit hunter, Pisha, beat his wife for sleeping with the whalers. He also beat his infant daughter, who died.
The captain went to see that Mr. Whitaker. There's no law that time, no police. He said, how do they punish people like that in Christianity at the time? So he said, wrap a fellow around a pole, tie him up, take his shirt off and give him 30 lashes. He said, maybe we'd do it to teach the Inuit the real law of how people could punish.
What the community remembers now is that the person who organized the flogging and who laid in the first lashes was the missionary Whitaker. And this apparently made a bad impression on the community, who had been listening to this guy talk about, the gospel of love and so on, and saw it as a serious contradiction that he should be so bent on revenge.
The church compound stood empty. For the Inuvialuit, God was once again just a profanity spoken by the whalers.
Putagor came to our place after New Year's in 1915 with the news that in the south, in Germany, the white men were waging war, and that we would be unable to obtain what was needed to live. He was very sad because he thought it would be impossible to live without these things.
The Great War marked the death knell for whaling on Herschel. The bowheads had all but disappeared. Ships commandeered for the war never returned. The great big town of Nuliak's youth was no more. The departure of the whalers did not overly concern Nuliak, as the Inuvialuit returned to their traditional life. The hunting and trapping skills he had worked so hard to master would be of great value in the fur trade which was arriving from the south. It was to be the final learning curve in the life of the orphan boy.
Often, I was the only one to kill something. I knew my rifle, and I never missed. In those days, our dogs were skilled in hunting Nanook, the polar bear. They easily recognized a fresh trail. For tracking, the dogs were unhitched from the sled. When they began to bark, Nanook was at bay.
The Cockneys bring the caribou they've killed to the old whaling station at Pauline Cove. There, the women of the family will skin the hide and dress the meat.
Thanks a lot. We accomplished our goal.
Thanks a lot.
Winnie Cockney, who married Nuliak's son, works with her daughters, Jane, Rosa, Kathy, and Topsy. Each year, fewer of the younger generation learn the old ways. All but one of Topsy's children have moved away to the south.
They live their life so modern. They don't have that desire as much as I do in my age group to continue to go on the land. I don't know, I guess you could lose that as the generation goes by. They phone, from Vancouver, from Ottawa. It's their choice, I guess.
When you put that down on the floor for mattress, and when you sleep on it, you never get cold from the ground. Yeah. This is better than the mattresses that they make nowadays.
When Papa used to travel, our dad used to travel. That's all he used to use for double it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Two cables, one in the bottom, one on top.
Oh, okay.
You made it for him.
Once again, the whims of fashion in the cities of the south made their impact felt in the Arctic. Nuliak would become an entrepreneur in the white fox trade, where a single pelt could fetch $50.
They could compete against whites on something closer to an equal footing. The Inuvialuit had learned a lot from the whalers, knew how to function as entrepreneurs. There were Inuvialuit who owned trading posts. There were Inuvialuit who owned big schooners.
That summer of 1926, I owned a schooner at last. It was a brand new one, built that year, and called the Bonnie Bell. It was 40 feet long, with a Francisco Standard heavy-duty 10-horsepower machine to make fire. It worked beautifully.
Change was now a constant. Even the land, thought by the Inuvialuit to belong to all, was to be divided. Officials arrived from Ottawa to negotiate treaties with the native people. Nuliak would represent the Inuvialuit.
They were offered $5. They said, well, that's not much. They thought they really were not very wise to offer $5 when someone was getting $30 for a white fox pelt. It didn't make a lot of sense.
The white chief asked me if I had something to say. I said to the white chief, "We have no business to do with you. Keep your $5.
The Inuvialuit would not sign a treaty for another 60 years. Winnie Cockney prepares to leave the island. Each year now it is the same, not knowing whether she will have the opportunity to return. An offshore drilling rig has dropped anchor in Pauline Cove, seeking shelter from the advance of winter, not unlike the whaling ships that caused two worlds to collide a century ago. The family begins the long journey home, with oil prices skyrocketing because of another war in the south. The future of this coast is uncertain. The North Shore of Alaska, just to the west of Herschel, was a wildlife refuge. The calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd that Nuliak once hunted to survive are scheduled to become a massive oil field. Some say the caribou will never return. The Inuvialuit will have to adapt yet again. In the 1950s, as a young woman, Winnie witnessed the exploitation of the land on a scale previously unimaginable to the Inuit. When the whalers left, the oceans had been able to heal. But now the demand for fossil fuels and the Cold War with the Soviets meant a campaign of industrial development from which there would be no return. Nuliak watched the Inuvialuit pushed off the land, conscripted into a labor force that would build the new North.
Nuliak lived through this profound transformation, where he was one of the last ones of his generation to have really spent a long time on the land. And now he's seeing the changes that are occurring, and they are profound indeed.
Nuliak's generation would watch helplessly as their grandchildren were enrolled in residential schools, isolated from their families, denied the ability to speak their language, robbed of their Inuvialuit culture. Worlds collide. Things fall apart.
I hunt no longer. I have become old. I, who have ever been on the go, now I keep house. When I was young, while everyone around me was cold, I did not feel a thing. Now if I go out, even in mild weather, I feel chilled.
Disease was not just a thing of the past. A new epidemic from the south began to decimate the native population. Tuberculosis. The once proud elders of the community were broken by this often fatal affliction of the respiratory system. Diagnosed with tuberculosis, Nuliak was assigned to the Campsall Hospital in Edmonton.
Today in Inuvik, we are expecting an airplane to arrive. The nurses want me to stay at the TB ward at the hospital. We left for Edmonton in the evening.
It was a journey into accelerated time, into the great engine that drove the development of the North. Isolated from their communities, Aboriginal people from across Canada were being assembled at Campsall to undergo the radical treatments necessary to cure TB. Nuliak was once again Robert Cockney, patient 483-67605.
People passed by without speaking to me. Vehicles never stopped going by. There is still no sign of snow. If my body and heart finish, take me, take my body to my own country, North.
Nuliak died on May 4th, 1966. His body was shipped to Tuktoyaktuk for burial. Today, Topsy Cockney, Nuliak's granddaughter, travels the ice road across the Beaufort Sea to visit his grave. The ice in the Mackenzie Delta, which once held the whaling ships in its grip for 9 months of the year, is 6 meters thick.
I can always relate with him. I can't stay in one place very long. You know, I'm constantly moving, whether I go into a different city or moving. I'm just not in one place. And when you follow my grandfather, he was like that. He never kept still. I know I have to be here. You know, I still have my mother around. And I still enjoy going on the land with my family. Maybe I'm a generation that can't leave. The old traditional way is gone, and we don't live like that anymore. So I think he really wanted to let people know, like, what we were prior to you guys coming.
Nuliak and his wife Margaret are buried in the cemetery at Tuktoyaktuk, overlooking the Arctic Ocean, facing west towards Herschel Island, where another graveyard tells the story of a time when men from around the world came to this tiny speck of frozen land to seek their fortune. A place where two worlds collided, and the history of the North was changed forever.